Diablo 4 is an action ARPG, more specifically the grandfather of the Slooter, the slash and loot dungeon delving experience, whereby grinding through endless hordes of monsters you acquire powerful pieces of gear that make your character more efficient at, in your ability to enjoy, killing those same monsters over and over again. While this straightforward concept may seem simple on paper, what it ultimately means is that the developers of this Diablo game and all of those from the past had to find ways of being able to individually tailor experiences and give a multitude of various players and desired playstyles avenues to be able to explore and experience both a class identity, a power fantasy, and fulfilling progression through what is ultimately an infinitely iterative slot machine experience. And since the games continue to see balance changes and updates, the developers have to continuously reinvent the same puzzle, reaffix the same lock, and give players a continuously evolving array of keys and tools to be able to unlock this power so that they can go on to experience their gameplay fantasy as they see fit. But the interesting thing, as a huge Magic the Gathering fan, I began playing the game when I was a small child, right around the time that I could start reading. I remember my dad handing me his first deck of cards and me feeling like an absolute badass when I managed to put together 6 forests required to be able to spawn my first ever Crawworm. How could anything possibly beat my 6/4 that was going to take over the game? Well, considering my dad's friends was a white weenie tryhard and inevitably had a Serra Angel, I couldn't do much against this flyer. But while the trip down memory lane is mostly just for me to smile and remember the good days, and also to gain me cred with the people who hopefully the algorithm has shown this video to, but a brilliant discovery made itself known to me when I was recently considering the vast intricacies and nuances that would require me to be able to successfully lobby and argue for balance changes to my favorite class, the Necromancer. And that's the fact that Diablo 4, and every video game that gets consistent updates, either season to season or patch to patch, is running into the exact same issues that Wizards of the Coast and now Hasbro have had to deal with for years and decades on that, and attempting to balance the massive game that is Magic the Gathering. So I've identified a phenomena that I'm going to call the overpower singularity. And for you to be able to understand what that means and ultimately the purpose of this video, I should probably explain the terminology. So just like a black hole singularity, where everything eventually crumples down to a single potential outcome, the overpower singularity describes the current theory crafting and build tech of any competent build in Diablo 4. It's a simple question. Can your build overpower? If yes, you should seek to make it overpower as often as possible, because it is by far the strongest avenue to direct power and damage scalability currently available in the game. But it is much more insidious than that. If your build can overpower, then it can also critically strike. Because of that, you must seek to critically strike 100% of the time. And then on top of that, since all damage is increased by the vulnerable status on a target. But if you can apply vulnerable, you should apply it 100% of the time. And then following this logical trail to its conclusion, if your build cannot apply vulnerable, cannot critically strike, or cannot overpower, it is almost certainly weak enough that you should not even consider attempting to play it. And just like in Magic, where there realistically is only one outcome, either you or your opponent will win the game by successfully killing the other one. In Diablo 4, as well as any ARPG, the ultimate end goal is to attempt to create a perfect character. This tends to occur by successfully completing any forms of power systems and or finding a perfect set of gear. So anything in Magic the Gathering that can successfully help you to be able to kill your opponent faster, whether it is dealing lethal damage, applying a lethal amount of poison counters, or by successfully milling out your opponent, causing them to fail to draw a card after all of the cards are removed from their library. The ultimate end goal of a Diablo 4 build is efficiency, and this tends to come primarily through the ability to apply enough damage per second to be able to kill monsters within whatever constraint you are currently farming in. Now, I'd like to delve into an example from Magic the Gathering that I hope can paint this picture in a really foundational way. When Magic the Gathering first hit the scene, the creators of the game could never possibly come to understand just how many new ways they were going to have to reinvent the wheel that was ultimately giving players the tools needed to beat their opponent. Longtime players of the game are going to remember a set of cards known nowadays as the Power 9. These were incredibly powerful cards that at this point are not even really legal to play in the majority of formats, but on top of that will never be printed again. The example that we'll look at is Ancestral Recall. And while there is a lot of nuance to the various words on this card and how it interacts with the game, for a single mana at instant speed, you can choose to just draw 3 cards. And while this may not immediately set off in your head why that is powerful, let's consider what a card game is in the form of Magic the Gathering. The only way to kill your opponent is to play cards which will move you towards successfully killing them. You can summon monsters that can do damage, you can play spells that do damage or force them to destroy parts of their deck or discard cards from their own hand, and you're only normally allowed to draw a single card every turn, which means is that ultimately you will run out of cards as long as you have built a competent deck that can successfully play them. Ancestral Recall is an insane amount of something called card advantage. By playing a card which not only replaces itself but draws 2 more from your deck, you've effectively turned 1 card into 3 cards. And if you've built a competent deck, any card that you draw from your deck should further your ability to win the game. So 1 mana to be able to do this is incredibly powerful. And again, it is so powerful that it has been banned in the vast majority of formats that it could possibly be played in. In our example here, Ancestral Recall is going to be equivalent to successfully overpowering. It is a wildly powerful effect that if you could just do it without any hesitation or restriction, it would clearly be the strongest single effect that you could continuously replicate doing over and over again. And the banning of Ancestral Recall can be likened to the initial restrictions that existed for Overpower in the first place. It was something that was typically difficult to accomplish, had very restrictive or niche ways of being able to empower it, but because it was so powerful, if you could succeed at doing it, the payoff from it would be astonishing. But if our story ended there, it wouldn't be that interesting to consider. And not only that, but the developers would not have created interesting systems for us to explore and unlock the power of. So let's look at a more modern version of Ancestral Recall. This card is called Treasure Cruise. Now at a moment's glance, Treasure Cruise looks like an absolutely terrible card. Attempting to get the same effect, which is drawing 3 cards, is now going to cost you 8 mana. Not only that, Ancestral Recall was an instant, meaning you could basically do it to interrupt other people or whenever you wanted as long as you had mana to do it. Treasure Cruise is a sorcery, meaning that unless there's very specific circumstances in play, you can only cast this card during your turn. And while that doesn't seem like a big issue, sorceries only being able to occur on your turn and not being able to be used to interrupt other things tend to be a lot more clunky and difficult to execute. So under any normal circumstance, being able to spend 1 mana to draw 3 cards is clearly better than 8 mana to draw those 3 cards. You would always want to be able to do the faster, more efficient version of this if you could. But Treasure Cruise comes along with a very important keyword in the form of Delve. Now, Delve is going to get a little bit nitty-gritty here, but stick with me. Delve says that you can reduce the cost of this spell by 1 by removing a card from your graveyard into exile. Whenever your monsters are destroyed or whenever you have successfully cast a spell, these cards will go into your graveyard. They're still there, you can still find ways of getting them back into your hand or bringing them back to the battlefield. Putting cards into exile is even more restrictive. That means that they're just gone from the game entirely. So if you had some ability that could dig down into your graveyard and pull a monster back from the dead, if you push it into exile, you can no longer do that. But if you could somehow manage to get 7 cards into your graveyard and then toss all of them into exile, a huge price to pay and a mechanically difficult thing to accomplish, Treasure Cruise effectively becomes Ancestral Recall. The total cost drops back down to 1. The effect is that you draw 3 cards. Now there's still some restriction, the difference between an instant and a sorcery and the fact that technically speaking Ancestral Recall can make somebody else draw cards, but those nuances are not really important to the example here. If drawing the 3 cards is our ability to overpower, then Delve is the unique amulet Banished Lord's Talisman. It is an item which fundamentally changes your strategy. Your strategy in this example being related to the composition of your deck. While Banished Lord's Talisman requires you to spend 275 essence before you can successfully overpower, the Delve requires you to kick 7 cards into exile. By adding these additional steps that the player must go to either overpower or successfully draw 3 cards, the developers have done something so much more than just give you an avenue to an old power that you still want to get. Both the build and the deck will have to fundamentally change to be able to successfully trigger these effects. And the byproduct of this will very often come in the form of giving value to either an ability or a skill in Diablo 4, or to cards in Magic the Gathering that otherwise would have seen no play or use. things that were originally considered to be too weak or too clunky to ever consider using. For Magic the Gathering, this is going to be Stinkweed Imp. I know, stick with me here. Stinkweed Imp is not a particularly impressive card, at least not as a monster that can deal damage, but it is the keyword Dredge that takes this one-time nearly useless card and makes it a staple, something that goes on to define the functionality of a deck in its entirety. Dredge says, if you were to draw a card, instead of doing that, you can take cards from the top of your deck and put it directly into your graveyard. If you do, you can return this card from the graveyard to your hand, or if you don't want to do that, you can then draw a card. And since the end result is a card draw trigger, which could then act on any other cards in your graveyard which say Dredge, you can continue to do this ad nauseum as long as you continue to hit new Dredge triggers, or you choose to stop the effect. So you can see how this may be particularly useful for Treasure Cruise. Stinkweed Imp can effectively put 5, 10, even 20 cards into your graveyard, depending on how many of them are already in your graveyard. And then you can very easily exile all of them for the Delve keyword, and then play your 1 mana draw 3 cards. In our Diablo 4 example, our Stinkweed Imp right here is the skill Bone Spirit. Bone Spirit is a skill which says spend all of your resource. Then with the addition of a specific temper on your rings and amulet, which says whenever you cast Bone Spirit, automatically regain a bunch of resource, as well as just the base effect of the skill itself, which says after it hits something, begin generating 30% of your maximum resource over 4 seconds. And because we exist in a day and age where being able to cast Bone Spirit at maximum attack speed and with no cooldown, we can spam this skill. Just like we could cascade through, that's a little Magic the Gathering pun there, but we could cascade through multiple dredges from Stinkweed Imp and similar cards to be able to fill up the requirements of both Treasure Cruise's Delve cost and Banishlord's Talisman resource cost. And by changing our Magic the Gathering deck to have these tools in it, we can regain the ability to consistently spend 1 mana and draw 3 cards. Whereas in Diablo 4, we can gain the ability to consistently overpower on whatever skill we want, as long as it's a core skill. I hope by this point in the video, I've at least managed to convince you that there is some interesting and even strikingly similar connective tissue between these two concepts across completely different games in different genres and even completely disparate mediums of gameplay development. But what I may have not have convinced you of yet is the problem with the overpower singularity, the reason for the entirety of this video in the first place. And if I'm being honest, it's because I've withheld information from you. I haven't been completely honest. Because while I've been painting this picture, what I haven't shown you is the stark reality of this little unassuming card by the name of Treasure Cruise. If you'll remember back when I first introduced you to the card Ancestral Recall, I made it clear that this was such a powerful card that not only would it never be reprinted, but it was also banned in the majority of formats that you could possibly play it in. And even in the formats that you can play it in, it is restricted, meaning that you can have less than the total maximum of 4 cards that you're normally legally allowed to have any one copy of. But here's my best attempt at an M. Night Shyamalan twist. Treasure Cruise is banned and restricted in all of the exact same formats. It turns out taking an instant card and changing it to sorcery speed, drastically reducing when you can cast it, as well as taking a mana cost from 1 all the way up to 8, is not enough to make the insane power of drawing 3 cards reasonably balanced enough to play in casual or even competitive Magic the Gathering. And people have caught on to the fact that the entirety of this video is in experiencing this duality to be able to draw conclusions. It turns out Banishlord's Talisman is also causing a problem. While every build would seek to overpower if it can overpower, one of the only ways that is reasonable for any of them to attempt to do this is through this one item. And while every class will find a different way of proccing the item, be able to force overpower to various levels of consistency, whenever you are putting together a build, you will ask the question, can I proc Banishlords, and can I make this an overpower build? Now, all of this is to say, having incredibly powerful cards in Magic the Gathering, as well as broken and over-representative strategies in build theory crafting in Diablo 4 is not necessarily a bad thing. If you remember, I said that one of the achievements of the developers is to create an ever-evolving set of locks and keys, puzzle pieces and tools for the players to be able to uncover and progress through and eventually unlock this power. It adds to a meaningful sense of progression, as well as giving value to things that otherwise would never see the light of day or never be used in a meta build. I posit here to you that ultimately that is a good thing, and that it is healthy for any game to continue to re-explore things which have already been created, to give them new value, and to make them relevant in the meta again, so that people who have enjoyed them in the past can continue to do so, as well as new players get to discover something that is long laid dormant, and they get to have their own eureka moments to find this power, and to be able to experience the power fantasy that their class gets to enjoy. And while it would be easy for me to just leave this topic here, just hand it off to you to discuss down in the comments, debate on Reddit, or maybe just noodle on it while you're listening to this on your commute either to work or home, I would prefer to not have a wishy-washy stance. I personally hate when somebody makes me listen to this long of a rant and doesn't give me an end result. I think that the overpower singularity is a problem. I think that it restricts and homogenizes the build landscape moving forward, as well as limiting design space. The developers cannot continue to give us new tools and new avenues of power if all they will do is compound on the existing systems and continue to move every build towards the exact same collection of gear, stats, and outcomes. I think what lays at the heart of an ARPG is player agency, and a promise made to us by the Diablo 4 developers when the game first released, which is constantly quoted and requoted, which is play your way. And while I think many of the people in our community are too often willing to give up their own sense of responsibility or agency in various forms of the developers are forcing me to do this. In reality, if you want to be competitive, and if you want to make the best version of something possible, as long as the overpower singularity is just over the horizon, another pun for you there, things will inevitably fall towards that reality. And my only fear is that rather than address the tools that are enabling it, the core concept of overpower will either be nerfed or fundamentally changed, so that things can no longer abuse it, but simultaneously, builds which have historically used as their primary source of power will now be uncompensated and left without tools of their own, ultimately suffering at the hands of the popularity of a thing when they were the cool hipsters who were doing it first. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you're new here, consider subscribing as well and leave a like on it. If you had your own thoughts or ideas, if I sparked anything inside of this, or you have had this conversations in other circles, I would love to discuss it down in the comments. But again, thank you very much for watching this video. I truly hope that you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.